June 6, 1944. While American forces storm Omaha Beach under devastating German fire, the most feared Allied general in Europe sits in England, reading reports and waiting for a phone call that won't come. George S. Patton, the man Germans called Dear Blutiger Patton, Bloody Patton, the general who broke through Sicily faster than anyone thought possible, isn't even allowed on the beaches of Normandy. Think about that for a moment. The largest amphibious invasion in human history is happening, and the Allies deliberately chose not to include their most aggressive, most successful armored commander. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't poor planning. This was intentional. The Allies didn't forget Patton, they contained him. Now, if you've watched other D-Day documentaries or read the standard histories, you've probably heard the official explanation. Patton was being held in reserve for a later phase of the invasion. He was too valuable to risk in the initial assault. But here's what those sanitized histories won't tell you. The real reason Patton missed D-Day had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with political control. By June 1944, George Patton had become something unprecedented in modern warfare. A general too dangerous for his own side to fully trust, yet too valuable to discard. He was brilliant, aggressive, and utterly unpredictable. He won battles faster than anyone expected, but he also created diplomatic incidents that threatened the entire Allied coalition. And in the careful, calculated world of international warfare, that made him a liability. The truth is, Patton scared Allied leadership almost as much as he scared the Germans. Not because of his tactical abilities, those were unquestionable, but because of what he represented. Pure, uncontrolled military aggression in an age where wars had to be won politically as much as militarily. Patton didn't just fight enemies, he obliterated them. He didn't just capture territory, he raced ahead of supply lines and coordination plans. And most dangerously of all, he didn't just speak his mind, he spoke it to reporters. This created a fundamental problem for the Allied command structure. World War II wasn't just about defeating Nazi Germany. It was about maintaining a coalition between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union that had very different post-war objectives. Every major decision had to consider not just military effectiveness, but political ramifications. How would this play in Washington? How would Churchill react? What would Stalin think? Patton, brilliant as he was, operated in a world where military logic was the only logic that mattered. Consider what had happened in Sicily just months before Normandy. Patton's 7th Army had torn across the island so quickly that it embarrassed the British 8th Army, commanded by Montgomery. This wasn't just a tactical success, it was a diplomatic nightmare. British pride was wounded, command relationships were strained, and Patton, being Patton, had made public comments that made everything worse. Then came the slapping incident, 2 separate occasions where Patton physically struck shell-shocked soldiers, calling them cowards. When this became public, it created a media firestorm that threatened to derail his career entirely. But here's the crucial point that most people miss. The incident didn't just damage Patton's reputation. It revealed something fundamental about how he approached warfare that made Allied leadership deeply uncomfortable. Patton believed in total war. He believed in breaking the enemy's will through overwhelming aggression. He believed in pursuing victory regardless of the cost in public relations or political convenience. This philosophy had made him incredibly effective in Sicily and would later make him devastatingly effective in France, but it also made him impossible to control. By early 1944, Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower faced a dilemma that no military textbook had prepared him for. He had a general who could win battles faster than anyone else in the Allied arsenal, but who could also destroy carefully negotiated political relationships with a single press conference. He had a commander who understood armored warfare better than almost anyone alive, but who couldn't understand why military decisions should be constrained by diplomatic considerations. The solution they came up with was as brilliant as it was cynical. Use Patton, but contain him. Give him a role important enough to utilize his talents, but controlled enough to prevent him from creating diplomatic disasters. And most importantly, keep him away from the most crucial moments of the war until the political situation was stable enough to handle his unpredictability. This is why Patton wasn't at D-Day. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because he was too good at exactly the wrong things. The Allies needed the Normandy invasion to succeed not just militarily, but politically. They needed it to demonstrate Allied unity, careful planning, and measured progress. They needed it to be controllable. Patton, by definition, was not controllable. What makes this story even more fascinating is that the Germans expected Patton to lead the invasion. German intelligence had identified him as the most capable Allied commander, and they assumed he would spearhead any major offensive. The fact that he wasn't involved in D-Day actually contributed to German strategic confusion about where the real invasion would come. So the question isn't why Patton was kept out of D-Day. The question is why a coalition of democracies felt they needed to sideline their most effective general at the most critical moment of the war. And the answer reveals something uncomfortable about how modern warfare really works. Sometimes your most dangerous weapon isn't the enemy. It's the general you can't control. To understand why the Allies feared George Patton, you have to understand the impossible balancing act that Dwight Eisenhower faced as Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower wasn't just running a military campaign. He was managing the most complex political-military coalition in history. On paper, the Americans, British, and Soviets were allies united against Nazi Germany. In reality, they were three powers with fundamentally different visions for post-war Europe, each suspicious of the other's motives, each protecting their own national interests, even while fighting a common enemy. This created a command environment where military decisions couldn't be made purely on military merit. Every major operation had to be evaluated through multiple lenses. How would this affect American public opinion? Would it strengthen or weaken British influence in Europe? Would Stalin interpret this as evidence of Western aggression or weakness? For Eisenhower, managing these competing interests was often more difficult than fighting the Germans. George Patton understood none of this, and frankly, didn't care. In Patton's worldview, warfare was about identifying the enemy and destroying them as quickly and thoroughly as possible. Politics were for politicians. Diplomacy was for diplomats. His job was to win battles, and he was extraordinary at it. But this single-minded focus on military effectiveness made him a constant threat to the delicate coalition that Eisenhower was trying to hold together. The British were particularly wary of Patton, and their concerns went far beyond his aggressive tactical style. Britain entered World War II as a global empire, but by 1944 it was increasingly clear that the war's end would leave America as the dominant Western power. British military leaders were acutely aware that their influence in post-war Europe would depend largely on their ability to demonstrate continued military competence and leadership alongside their American allies. Patton threatened this balance in multiple ways. His rapid advances in Sicily had overshadowed British forces commanded by Bernard Montgomery, creating embarrassing comparisons in the press. More troubling for British leadership, Patton's success reinforced American arguments about the superiority of aggressive, mechanized warfare over the more methodical approach favored by many British commanders. Every time Patton achieved dramatic battlefield success, it implicitly criticized the British way of fighting. But the British concerns went deeper than military rivalry. Patton had a documented history of making inflammatory public statements about Britain's role in the war and its post-war intentions. He questioned British commitment to aggressive prosecution of the war. He criticized what he saw as British cautiousness. Most dangerously, he sometimes voiced American suspicions about British imperial motives in the Mediterranean and Middle East. For British political leadership, keeping Patton away from major operations wasn't just militarily prudent, it was diplomatically essential. Eisenhower understood these dynamics better than perhaps any American commander. His entire career had been built on managing competing personalities and interests, first in peacetime staff positions and then in the pressure cooker of coalition warfare. He knew that military brilliance meant nothing if it destroyed the political consensus necessary to sustain the war effort. He had seen how Patton's remarks and actions could create weeks of diplomatic cleanup work, requiring careful communications with London, Washington, and sometimes Moscow to repair damaged relationships. This is why Eisenhower consistently chose control over brilliance when it came to command decisions. It wasn't that he didn't recognize Patton's extraordinary abilities. It was that he recognized the cost of unleashing those abilities without proper constraints. Patton could win battles, but he could also lose wars by destroying the political foundations that made victory possible. The challenge was that Patton's effectiveness and his uncontrollability were inextricably linked. His aggressive instincts and willingness to ignore conventional limitations were exactly what made him so devastating on the battlefield. You couldn't have Patton's tactical brilliance without accepting his political recklessness. And in the context of coalition warfare, political recklessness was often more dangerous than tactical mistakes. Consider how this played out in practical terms. When Patton advanced faster than planned, it created supply problems that affected other Allied units. When he made public statements critical of Allied strategy or Allied partners, it required damage control at the highest levels of government. When he pursued military objectives without regard for political considerations, it sometimes undermined broader strategic goals that extended far beyond immediate battlefield success. The Allies had learned this lesson painfully through previous experience with Patton. In Sicily, his rapid advance had been militarily brilliant but politically costly. His competition with Montgomery had created lasting tensions between American and British commands. His public statements had required intervention from Washington to smooth over diplomatic problems. Most telling, his slapping incident had demonstrated how quickly his actions could escalate from local military matters to international political crises. By 1944, Allied leadership had concluded that Patton was simply too dangerous to employ in any operation where political control was as important as military success. D-Day was exactly such an operation. The Normandy invasion had to succeed, not just as a military operation, but as a demonstration of Allied unity, competence, and shared commitment. It had to provide a foundation for the political cooperation that would be necessary to win the war and manage the peace. Patton's presence would have introduced an element of unpredictability that the operation couldn't afford, not because he might fail militarily, but because he might succeed too dramatically, or make statements that damaged Allied relationships, or create situations that required political intervention at the worst possible moment. The Allies needed D-Day to be controlled, measured, and politically sustainable. George Patton was none of those things. This is the real reason Patton was kept away from Normandy, not because he wasn't good enough, but because he was too good at exactly the wrong things for exactly the wrong moment. While George Patton was being kept off the beaches of Normandy, he was not being sidelined in the way most people imagine. He was being weaponized. By early 1944, Allied planners had identified a critical strategic problem. The success of the Normandy invasion depended not just on landing troops, but on convincing the Germans where not to concentrate their defenses. If German High Command correctly identified Normandy as the main invasion site and shifted its armored reserves there quickly, the landings could be contained or even thrown back into the sea. The Allies needed deception on a scale never attempted before. At the center of that deception stood Patton. German intelligence had spent years building psychological profiles of Allied commanders. Among them, one name dominated their assessments: George S. Patton. To the Germans, Patton represented American offensive doctrine at its most dangerous. He was fast, ruthless, and mechanized. German officers believed, correctly, that Patton was the general the Americans would use for any decisive blow. As far as the Wehrmacht was concerned, Patton was not optional. He was inevitable. Allied planners understood this perception and exploited it mercilessly. In the months leading up to D-Day, Patton was deliberately placed at the head of a fictitious formation, the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, it was the largest American force in Britain. In reality, it was an illusion. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, false radio traffic, staged headquarters activity, and controlled leaks through double agents all pointed to one conclusion for German intelligence: Patton was preparing to invade at Pas de Calais. This was not accidental. It was the most important deception of the war. The logic was simple and brutal. If Patton was not leading the Normandy landings, then Normandy could not be the main invasion. The Germans expected Patton to strike where the channel was narrowest and where armored forces could exploit success quickly. Pas de Calais fit that model perfectly. Normandy did not. The absence of Patton from D-Day was not a red flag to German planners, it was confirmation. This is where the story turns sharply against the myth that Patton was merely held in reserve. He was actively performing one of the most important roles of the invasion, misleading the enemy at the strategic level. His visibility in England was carefully managed. He appeared at camps. He inspected troops. He gave speeches that were certain to be noticed. His presence was meant to be seen, photographed, and reported, but he was never allowed near the real invasion force. The risk was too high. Patton was incapable of playing a purely symbolic role unless he believed in it. He was not a man who could be told to stand still and remain quiet indefinitely. His energy, his temperament, and his reputation all worked against restraint. Allied leadership understood that if Patton were brought too close to the actual operation, he might say something to the press, move too aggressively, or demand authority that would disrupt the carefully layered deception plan. This is why his containment mattered so much. The deception operation required consistency. Every signal sent to German intelligence had to reinforce the same narrative: Patton equals main effort. That meant Patton had to be visible, but controlled, active, but inert, powerful, but leashed. Any deviation could unravel months of planning. The irony is that Patton himself never fully understood the scale of the deception he was part of. He knew he was being used in some capacity. He knew he was being kept out of Normandy, but he did not appreciate that his enforced inactivity was a strategic weapon. To him, being sidelined felt like humiliation. To Allied planners, it was essential. German command took the bait completely. Even after June 6, 1944, after Allied troops were firmly ashore in Normandy, German armored reserves remained tied to Pas de Calais. Adolf Hitler and the OKW believed Normandy might still be a diversion. They waited for Patton. They expected his arrival to signal the real invasion. Days passed, then weeks. Still, major German formations stayed north, watching for Patton instead of crushing the beachhead. This delay saved the invasion. Had those armored divisions been released immediately toward Normandy, the Allied lodgment could have been destroyed before it stabilized. The deception bought time paid for by Patton's absence. In that sense, Patton's exclusion from D-Day was not just political containment, it was operational sacrifice. But this arrangement also reinforced Allied fears about Patton. The deception worked precisely because German intelligence trusted Patton's aggressiveness. They believed he would not sit idle while others fought the decisive battle. The fact that he appeared to be doing exactly that only strengthened their conviction that Normandy was a feint. Patton's personality was predictable enough to be manipulated by the enemy, and dangerous enough to require constant supervision by his own side. This duality defined Patton's role in the war. He was simultaneously the most feared Allied general in Europe and the most carefully managed. His reputation was a weapon, but his presence was a risk. Allied leadership wanted the former without the latter. That meant keeping him away from Normandy until the invasion was no longer fragile, until political stakes were lower, and until deception was no longer required. Only then would they unleash him. Patton as a decoy reveals the true logic behind his absence from D-Day. He was not sidelined because he was unreliable in battle. He was sidelined because his image was too powerful to waste and too dangerous to deploy freely. Normandy required patience, coordination, and restraint. Patton represented speed, disruption, and momentum. The Allies needed both qualities, but not at the same time. So while men died on Omaha Beach, Patton waited in England, playing the role the war demanded of him, not as a commander, but as a ghost the enemy could not ignore. When the first Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, George Patton's absence was not temporary, accidental, or conditional. It was deliberate, planned, and enforced. Even after the landings began, Patton was not allowed to move. This is the part of the story that directly contradicts the popular myth that Patton was simply held back until the situation clarified. By the time Allied forces were ashore, it was already clear that Normandy had succeeded tactically. The beachheads, though costly, were secure. German counterattacks had failed to throw the Allies back into the sea. At that point, a commander like Patton, aggressive, fast, decisive, would normally have been unleashed to exploit momentum. He wasn't. The reason lies in how the Allied command structure was designed to function under pressure. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, was not built to reward initiative at the top. It was built to prevent chaos. Dwight Eisenhower's authority rested on consensus, not domination. He did not command like a battlefield general. He commanded like a coalition manager. His greatest fear during the Normandy phase was not German resistance. It was Allied disunity. Patton represented the opposite of that model. Even after D-Day, the invasion was politically fragile. The beachhead was shallow. Supply lines were strained. British and American forces were operating side by side under constant scrutiny. Any major mistake, civilian casualties, friendly fire incidents, public statements contradicting Allied messaging, could trigger diplomatic fallout at exactly the wrong moment. Patton was notorious for all three risks. He moved faster than plans allowed. He spoke more freely than press officers could manage. He treated war as a contest to be won, not a performance to be explained. Allied leadership understood that once Patton was given operational command, he would push relentlessly, even if that meant outrunning logistics, ignoring coordination, or embarrassing other commanders. In the narrow confines of Normandy, this was unacceptable. The Bocage country demanded slow, methodical clearing. Armor could not maneuver freely. Infantry coordination mattered more than speed. This was Montgomery's preferred environment, not Patton's. Giving Patton command in Normandy risked doctrinal conflict, inter-allied friction, and public disputes over responsibility if things went wrong. So Patton was kept waiting. More importantly, German intelligence was still watching him. Even after June 6th, the Allies were unsure whether the Germans fully accepted Normandy as the main invasion. Pas-de-Calais remained heavily defended well into July. The deception plan had not yet paid its full dividend. Releasing Patton too early, allowing him to cross the Channel or take visible command, could signal to the Germans that the deception was over and that Normandy was, in fact, the decisive front. Allied planners were unwilling to take that risk. This is why Patton's Third Army was not activated until July 1st, nearly a month after D-Day. That delay was not operational necessity. It was strategic caution. Schaff wanted absolute certainty that German reserves would not redeploy northward before committing Patton to combat. There was also a personal dimension that cannot be ignored. Eisenhower did not trust Patton's judgment under political pressure. This was not hypothetical. Eisenhower had already been forced to publicly reprimand Patton over the slapping incidents. He had already intervened to prevent Patton's removal from command entirely. He knew that if Patton became the public face of Normandy, every success and every failure would be filtered through Patton's personality. That was a risk Eisenhower was not willing to accept. Normandy needed to look controlled. It needed to look planned. It needed to look like a collective Allied achievement, not the triumph of a single volatile American general. Eisenhower wanted the story of D-Day to be about unity, coordination, and shared sacrifice. Patton threatened that narrative simply by existing. So Patton waited. He waited while others fought the bloodiest battles of the invasion. He waited while the Bocage slowed Allied progress to a crawl. He waited while German resistance hardened and casualties mounted. And he waited, knowing that his exclusion was not based on incompetence, but on fear. Fear of what he might do if unleashed too early. This waiting frustrated Patton deeply. He believed, with some justification that he could break the stalemate faster than the commanders currently engaged. He believed that speed was being sacrificed for caution. He believed the war was being prolonged unnecessarily. What he did not fully grasp was that the delay was not about winning Normandy. It was about winning the war without breaking the alliance that made victory possible. Only once the deception had fully succeeded, once German reserves were irreversibly committed away from Normandy, and once the beachhead was stable enough to absorb disruption, did Eisenhower finally authorize Patton's release. When Patton crossed into France in August 1944, he did exactly what Allied leadership had expected. He moved faster than anyone else. He exploited gaps ruthlessly. He drove his army forward at a pace that shocked both friend and foe, but he did so only after the moment when his unpredictability could no longer endanger the larger political and strategic framework. Patton missed D-Day not because he was unneeded. He missed it because D-Day could not afford him. By late July 1944, the logic that had kept George Patton sidelined began to collapse under its own success. The Normandy beachhead had held. German armored reserves remained mispositioned. The deception that kept them tied to Pas-de-Calais had done its job. Most importantly, the invasion was no longer fragile. Allied forces were ashore in overwhelming numbers, supply lines were stabilizing, and the political narrative of D-Day had already been written. At that point, the balance between control and aggression shifted. This was the moment Allied leadership had been waiting for. On August 1, 1944, Patton's Third Army was activated in France. The leash was removed, not because Patton had changed, but because the conditions around him had. The political risk that once made him dangerous was now acceptable. The coalition could survive his excesses. The war could benefit from his speed. What followed confirmed everything Eisenhower both feared and needed. Patton did not conduct a cautious breakout. He did not wait for perfect coordination. He exploited Operation Cobra's rupture in the German lines with relentless momentum. His armored columns surged through Brittany and into central France faster than German command could respond. Towns fell in hours instead of days. German formations dissolved not because they were annihilated, but because they could not orient themselves against the pace of advance. This was Patton's true value. He was not a planner of delicate operations. He was a destroyer of enemy coherence. His genius lay in acceleration, turning tactical success into operational collapse before the enemy could recover. Once unleashed, he did exactly what Allied leadership had kept him from doing in Normandy. He outran expectations, doctrine, and sometimes his own logistics, and yet, this time, the system absorbed it. By August, the political stakes were lower. The invasion narrative was secure. British and American forces had clearly demonstrated unity. No single general could overshadow the achievement. Patton's advances no longer threatened coalition cohesion. They reinforced Allied dominance. Even when Patton created problems, the consequences were manageable. He strained supply systems to the breaking point, famously running short of fuel because his advance exceeded logistical planning. He complained loudly about restrictions, criticized caution, and pushed relentlessly for permission to continue eastward. But now, these behaviors were tolerated, even quietly admired. The war had entered a phase where speed mattered more than optics. The contrast with June is stark. Had Patton behaved this way during the Normandy landings, had he outrun coordination, embarrassed Allied partners, or forced emergency political interventions, the consequences could have been disastrous. In August, The same behavior accelerated victory. This is the central irony of Patton's sidelining. He was never kept out because he was wrong. He was kept out because he was right too early. Eisenhower's decision to delay Patton was not an indictment of Patton's abilities. It was an acknowledgment of timing. Coalition warfare is not about maximizing brilliance at every moment. It is about deploying the right kind of brilliance when the system can withstand it. Once the system could withstand Patton, he became indispensable. German commanders felt the difference immediately. Reports describe confusion, loss of contact between units, and a growing inability to form coherent defensive lines. Patton's Third Army did not fight set-piece battles whenever it could avoid them. It bypassed resistance, isolated strongpoints, and forced the Germans to react continuously rather than plan. This style of warfare was devastating, but only once the broader strategic framework was secure. Patton's later success retroactively fueled myths that he should have been present at D-Day, that his absence was a mistake, that the invasion would have progressed faster had he been unleashed earlier. These arguments miss the point. Patton's effectiveness in August does not prove he should have been used in June. It proves that his role required a stable foundation. Patton himself never accepted this logic. He believed the war was being fought too cautiously. He believed that speed could have shortened the conflict earlier. From a purely military perspective, he may have been right. From a political and coalition perspective, that calculation was incomplete. Wars fought by alliances are not won by the fastest general alone. They are won by keeping the alliance intact long enough for speed to matter. By the time Patton's tanks were racing across France, the alliance was no longer at risk of fracture. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Germans were retreating everywhere. Political disagreements, while still present, could not derail the campaign. The war had passed the point where a single commander's recklessness could undo it. That is why Patton's release feels explosive in hindsight. It wasn't sudden. It was conditional. He was unleashed only when his aggression could no longer threaten the structure above him, only when victory was no longer fragile, only when control could afford speed. Patton's career after Normandy is often remembered as proof that sidelining him was a mistake. In reality, it proves the opposite. It shows that Allied leadership understood exactly what they had in Patton and exactly when they could afford to use it. He was not excluded because he was untrustworthy. He was delayed because he was unstoppable. The decision to keep George Patton out of Normandy was not a tactical footnote. It was a case study in how modern wars are actually controlled. History often frames World War II as a contest of armies, strategies, and firepower. In reality, it was equally a contest of personalities, alliances, and political limits. Patton's sidelining exposes the tension at the heart of coalition warfare, the need to win battles without destabilizing the system that makes those battles possible. Patton represented a type of power that coalitions fear. He was decisive, fast, and publicly visible. His successes were unmistakable and often dramatic, but that same clarity made him disruptive. In a coalition, clarity can be dangerous. It creates comparisons, resentments, and questions about leadership that alliances work hard to suppress. Eisenhower understood something that battlefield commanders often do not. Authority in a coalition is fragile. It rests on trust, balance, and shared credit. A general who wins too visibly can weaken that balance as surely as one who fails. Patton's victories in Sicily had already done that. They embarrassed allies, inflamed rivalries, and forced political interventions far above the battlefield. Normandy could not afford that kind of disruption. This is why Patton's absence was not punishment, it was governance. Coalition leaders do not ask, who is the best fighter? They ask, who is safest to use right now? Safety, in this context, does not mean caution. It means predictability. It means a commander whose behavior will not generate diplomatic crises, public scandals, or internal fractures at the worst possible moment. Patton was none of those things. The Allies needed D-Day to function as proof of unity. The invasion had to look coordinated, disciplined, and collective. It had to reassure civilians, allies, and enemies that this was a shared effort with a single direction. Patton, by sheer force of personality, threatened to turn any operation he touched into a referendum on himself. That is why he was kept away until the narrative was secure. Once the beachhead was established and the deception complete, the rules changed. At that point, disruption became useful. Speed became decisive. Patton's aggression no longer threatened the alliance because the alliance no longer depended on appearances. Victory had momentum. The political scaffolding was strong enough to absorb shock. Patton's later success often fuels the argument that sidelining him was a mistake. That argument misunderstands the problem. His success proves that Allied leadership judged timing correctly. They did not deny his abilities, they sequenced them. This distinction matters because it challenges how we think about military excellence. The most effective commanders are not always deployed at the most critical moments. Sometimes they are withheld until the system can survive them. That is not cowardice. It is control. There is also a darker implication. If Patton, an Allied hero, could be deliberately constrained for political reasons, then the idea of purely merit-based command collapses. Wars are not laboratories where the best ideas win automatically. They are political systems where power is rationed. Patton sensed this, even if he never fully accepted it. He believed war should reward aggression and punish hesitation. Eisenhower believed war should be won without breaking the alliance that made victory possible. Both views were rational. Only one could govern. History tends to side with Patton because his story is simpler. A brilliant warrior held back by timid leaders fits a familiar narrative. The truth is less flattering to everyone involved. Patton was held back because he revealed too clearly how power really works. He showed that battlefield success can threaten political order. He forced leaders to choose between speed and stability. They chose stability, until stability no longer mattered. This is why the official explanations remain sanitized. Saying Patton was in reserve avoids admitting fear. Saying he was too valuable to risk avoids admitting mistrust. Saying the decision was purely strategic avoids acknowledging that generals can become political liabilities. But the documents, the timing, and the outcomes tell a different story. Patton was contained because he could not be trusted to operate within the constraints of coalition warfare at its most fragile moment. He was unleashed only when those constraints loosened. That pattern is not unique to World War II. It repeats in every large alliance, in every modern conflict. The most dangerous figures are not always enemies. Sometimes they are allies who cannot be controlled. Patton missed D-Day because D-Day needed obedience more than brilliance. He entered the war in France only when brilliance could no longer break the structure above it. That is the uncomfortable lesson behind his absence. Wars are not won by heroes alone. They are managed by systems that decide when heroes are allowed to act. If you want World War II explained through power, control, and decisions history prefers to soften. Subscribe to U2 Declassified. This is the war behind the victory stories.